impressed I am that at 8 o'clock in the morning, we have a room full of people here. And I apologize for being late, but this is a difficult hour for me. So thank you very much. As was said when I was introduced, I was part of the Reagan Administration. And I remember the first day on the job, when I walked into the office of then Secretary of Commerce, Malcolm Baldrige. And I said to Baldrige, here I am back. What's my job? And Baldrige said, Clyde, your job is to reduce the trade deficit. Now that was 1981. In 1981, the U.S. trade deficit globally overall was $21 billion annually. And everyone said it was unsustainable, it was impossible, and we just had to get that trade deficit down. So, coming from a business background, I asked Baldrige, I said, well, okay, great, sounds like a job I know how to do. What am I getting paid? And he gave me a number which I've forgotten, but I do remember it was a lot less than my wife and kids had become accustomed to. And I mentioned this to Baldrige. And he said, not to worry. He was a businessman himself. He understood entrepreneurial spirit. He'd make me a deal. Commerce Department would pay me a bonus, 10% of the amount by which I reduced the trade deficit. 5 years later, trade deficit was $150 billion. I owed Baldrige $15 billion. And I had to get into some other line of work. Now today, so this is 30 years later, almost exactly 30 years later, actually. What's the date today? Today's the 6th, 7th? 7th. So I walked into Baldrige's office on the 9th of September. So 2 days short of 30 years later, the U.S. trade deficit is $600 billion. And it truly is unsustainable. It's costing us about 12 million jobs a year. So just think about that. U.S. right now has unemployment rate, we say officially 9.1%. If you add up all the people who are working part-time or are discouraged and not looking for work, it's closer to 15 or 16%. But just staying with the 9.1%. If we didn't have a trade deficit, we wouldn't have hardly any unemployment. And so that just gives you a measure of the impact of the trade deficit on the U.S. economy and on communities like Dayton and others around the country. So the question is, how did we get here? Why is it that we're in a situation in which even when we have an economic recovery, as soon as we begin to get a bit of a recovery, our trade deficit goes skyrocketing, and our international debt increases. We're now the world's largest debtor of all time, globally to the tune of about $5 trillion. So how do we get into this mess? And of course it didn't happen overnight, and there are several factors. But I would say there are two things that are overriding. One is that we kind of forgot to read our own history. And the second is because we forgot to read our own history, we embraced false doctrines. So when I say we forgot to read our own history, what do I mean by that? Well, you all read every day the newspaper about China. China's dynamic, China's growing at 10% a year. You go into any consumer product store and virtually everything on the shelf is coming from China. And you read that China is now developing its own commercial aircraft. China is developing its own semiconductor industry. And China is on the march. There was a time when America was on the march. If you go back all the way to the founding of the Republic, the first document that was published by the United States Treasury in 1791 was Alexander Hamilton's Report on American Manufacturing. didn't say at that time. What he said was that America needed to catch up to Great Britain, which at that time was leading the Industrial Revolution. And he said we needed to do it by having an industrial policy, by providing support, government support for new industries and new manufacturers, by imposing high tariffs to protect infant, small U.S. manufacturers from unfair competition from Great Britain, by building infrastructure, by supporting research and development. The world's first patent office was recommended by Alexander Hamilton in that paper and was established in the United States a few years later. And so proceeding from Hamilton through the next 150 years, the United States acted in those days pretty much the same way China acts today. We built infrastructure, the Erie Canal, the transcontinental railroads, the first airmail delivery system, the internet. I could go on and on. But we had a concerted policy for 150 years to catch up to the Brits, to become the world's leading economy, and to become the leader in the key technologies of the time. I'll just tell you one story to illustrate what I'm talking about. In 1919, President Wilson was in Versailles negotiating the end of World War I. And he discovered that the British were reading his telegraph traffic. Now, how was it that the Brits were reading his telegraph traffic? Well, think about the internet today. Because the internet was developed first in the U.S., a lot of global internet traffic goes through the United States, even though it's not destined for the United States. The U.S. is the central hub of the global internet. In those days, London was the central hub of the global telegraph system. British Marconi was the Google of the time. And British Marconi was reading everybody's mail as it came through London, including President Wilson. And Wilson said, I don't like this. So he called up his then Secretary of the Navy, a guy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he said, Frank, the Brits are reading my mail, we got to stop it. I want you to set up a company that can beat British Marconi. So Roosevelt calls into his office the CEOs of AT&T, General Electric, United Fruit, Westinghouse, and he says to the guys, we're going to create a new company. U.S. Navy is going to be a 50% shareholder of this new company, and you will all be equal shareholders of the other 50%. And we're going to, through this company, we're going to overtake British Marconi and gain control of global telegraph traffic. Does anybody have any idea what the name of that company was, or is?
RCA.
RCA, yes, whoa! Nobody ever knows that, congratulations. Yes, RCA was essentially established by Woodrow Wilson. Just one example of the kind of thing that we used to do. Okay, so then we go through the Second World War, and we get into the Cold War, and we get into a whole new environment in which we change our perspective and our doctrines. And just to give you, again, a flavor for how things have changed, I was, as I said, in the Reagan Administration, and at one point in the mid-1980s, Japanese were launching development of a semiconductor industry in Japan. They were selling semiconductor chips into the U.S. market far below cost. They were dumping chips in the U.S. market. And this began to cause severe pain in Silicon Valley. Between 1984 and 1986, about 100,000 people lost their jobs in the valley. The semiconductor industry in the valley lost about $4 billion. And you don't think of it today, but in those days, Intel came very, very close to going under. And this led to discussion in Washington. Should Washington do something about this illegal dumping of semiconductor chips in the U.S. market? And I'll never forget one White House meeting that I participated in, A number of high-ranking officials were there, and the question was, should the Commerce Department initiate an anti-dumping action against the Japanese semiconductor industry? And the discussion went around the table. Dick Darman was then the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. And he said, well, why do we want a semiconductor industry? If our guys can't hack it, let them go. And I've forgotten who, I guess it was Herb Stein was the chief of the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And his comment was, potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? They're all chips. So you see the shift. Woodrow Wilson has said, damn it, we've got to have a telegraph. And these officials in the Reagan administration, let me hasten to say that this is not a Republican or Democratic thing. Both Democrats and Republicans in the last 50 years have acted exactly the same way on these competitiveness and trade issues. So here we were in the 1980s in the Reagan administration, after the Republican administration, saying, hey, why do we want a semiconductor industry? If you can't hack it, let them go. Huge shift in attitude. Or just, to give you another example of it, President Obama, Democrat, was in Shanghai about almost 2 years ago, his first trip to China, and he did a joint press conference with President Hu Jintao. And I was listening to the press conference, and at a certain moment, the President said, we've agreed that the United States will help China develop its own commercial airline. And he said it very quickly, and it kept on going. None of the press in the audience asked him any questions, but as I listened to that, I thought, holy mackerel. We have a trade deficit with this country. Airplanes is one of the few things that we still make, that we export, in which we have a trade surplus. Why is the President saying we're going to help the Chinese develop their commercial aircraft to compete with ours? And in fact, I followed that up. I went actually to the State Department and asked that question. And the answer was, well, it'll be win-win, because we'll be able to sell some of the parts and components to the Chinese, and so we'll all benefit. So again, you see this change in attitude. Now, let me just mention what I mean here when I say false doctrines. Some of you, I can see in the audience, have enough gray hair that I guess you remember Vietnam. And I guess you remember that during the Vietnam War, we had a doctrine that we called the domino theory. The domino theory was that if Vietnam went communist, all the rest of Indochina and Southeast Asia, and maybe even all of Asia, would go communist. And therefore we had to stop the Vietnamese, the Vietnam in Vietnam to prevent this falling of the dominoes. Now, in retrospect, we all realized this was really a silly, simplistic, superficial, dumb, deadly doctrine. But we didn't realize that until 55,000 American kids had been killed and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. Or to give you another example, after World War I, General Billy Mitchell became an advocate of air power. And he went to the Navy, to the admirals in the Navy, and he said, the day of the battleship is over. It's all about air power. And they poo-pooed it. And he said, look, give me a couple of battleships and I'll show you, I'll sink them. And so the Navy gave him a couple of old battleships, and he sank each one with one bomb. And for his trouble, he was court-martialed and drugged out of the Army. And it wasn't until Pearl Harbor that suddenly all the smart defense analysts in the country realized, oh, Mitchell was right. Now, the point I'm trying to make is it's possible for smart people to embrace dumb ideas for a long time. And that's what we have been doing as a country with regard to our trade and our industrial and competitiveness policies for a very long time. And what I have to do right now is shut up according to my time. So thank you very much.